Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask me if I could explain to them the difference between things like tension, tonnage, volume, and how all this relates to training. So I'm going to make an effort to bring all these things down into simple to understand concepts and understanding how to actually compare them with each other. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, honestly, people make this stuff out to be really complicated, like it's rocket science. It really isn't. All that we're looking at with all of these numbers and terms is determining how much work did your muscles do, because that's all that matters. If muscles do enough work to stimulate growth, they will grow. As long as they recover and are given sufficient nutrition and rest and everything else, they will grow if they've been subjected to enough work. It is work that makes muscles grow. And we can discuss these terms all we want, but all these terms are something that exists so that we can determine and ensure that our muscles are doing more work over time. That's it. That's all we're concerned with. Tension is a very, very straightforward concept. Tension is how much weight, how much force has been put on the muscle, how much weight is it being forced to lift. And again, don't overthink this. People want to overthink these concepts. Look, it's only comparable on the same exercise and the same range of motion, meaning your tension actually varies on different exercises through the different range of motion. Your chest does a lot more work at the bottom than it does at the top with the same weight. So if you change your range of motion 2 inches, the tension becomes completely irrelevant because you need more weight to get more tension. And that's where it gets confusing to people. Same thing with a bicep curl. The tension is constant with the same weight if you do the same range of motion. If you add 5 pounds to it, you've added 5 more pounds of tension. But if you change the range of motion, you can't compare them equally anymore. All we know is that the shorter range of motion puts less tension on the muscle at certain points, so it needs more weight to get the same tension. But if you keep everything constant, which you should, all exercises should be performed through a full range of motion, or at least the same range of motion every time you perform them. And if you're deviating from that, not only are things harder to track, you're probably not stimulating a muscle ideally. So we need to lose this concept of doing partial reps and stuff anyways. It honestly clouds these, and these sort of numbers have been used by some people to promote doing partials, and that isn't going to give the desired results. Full range of motion training 95% of the time will produce the best possible development of a muscle. There are exceptions, but we don't need to really get into those. It's the majority of the time. Tension is basically how much weight you have on the bar or the dumbbell on any given exercise. Okay, pretty straightforward because that's a direct measurement as far as what's happening at the muscle. The tension will be determined at any given point in the range of motion by the weight on the bar. That's the only part that you really have control over, is the weight. So tension is basically the weight. So when we talk about increasing mechanical tension on a muscle, we're talking about the weight. And you know what? Mechanical tension is a direct driver of hypertrophy. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It doesn't matter whether you're doing 1 rep sets, 5 rep sets, 10 rep sets. If you're adding weight to the bar and you can do the same number of reps, whether it's 1, 5, 10, whatever, that muscle is going to grow as you add weight to the bar, as long as you're using the same range of motion and technique, so you're not cheating the weight up to get more on there. You're going to grow. It's a growth stimulator. It's the most important growth stimulator. We start caring about volume and tonnage when we want to really look at how much total workload a muscle is doing, because those are interchangeable terms. They're interchangeable because volume is meaningless without weight. If we say, oh, do 3 sets of 10 on an exercise, does that mean anything? I don't know. Do we mean 3 sets of 10 with 5 pounds or 500 pounds? Both 3 sets of 10. Volume is about how many reps and sets you did with a given amount of weight. And we could interchange that with tonnage, because what is a ton? A ton is a standard unit of measurement for 2,000 pounds. A ton is 2,000 pounds. So we would say if you did 400 pounds on the deadlift and you did, 25 reps in a workout, 5 sets of 5 with that's 10,000 pounds. Now your tonnage is like 5 tons. We're just using that as a term. It doesn't have to be measured in tons. You could say that you moved 10,000 pounds on the deadlift today. Well, that's good for comparative measurements, because if you want to track your workloads in different phases, week to week, month to month, looking at your total weekly tonnage on your big exercises, your biggest growth stimulating exercisers, is a very good way to track changes in training volume over time, right? Meaning, if you want to compare different phases of training where you're changing rep ranges a little bit, you can look at your tonnage or volume and kind of see if there's an upward trend in it. Now, I do want people to understand tonnage or higher volume training, as you start to increase volume, it can be very beneficial for increasing muscle size. People try to say, oh, it's the best way. No, it's not. The best way to increase muscle size is to add weight to the bar. Anyone who tells you otherwise is full of nonsense. They're full of BS. Because tonnage only becomes useful for creating workload. The volume creates workload so that when a muscle is no longer getting stronger, you can't add weight to the bar. Adding more volume with a weight that you can work with will force the muscle to grow. If the muscle grows, it will allow you to later increase the weight on the bar, the tension. Okay? And so if you're seeing a general upward trend in tonnage, you want to compare different workouts. You can look at your different tonnage and get a good idea of the amount of work you did. But people get this idea that the tonnage is the only stimulator of muscle growth, the volume is, and that's not true. Tension is actually, again, probably the most powerful stimulator. The problem is you can't just continually increase tension. And what we generally find, a given workout, at most, a given amount of tension or workload on a muscle will only cause it to grow for at most about 3 weeks. If you haven't added more work in some way within a 3-week period of time, a muscle will stop growing completely. So in other words, if you've been doing 3 sets of 10 with 155 pounds on the bench press, and you stay there and you don't ever increase the volume or the weight on the bar or anything, you will stop growing within a few weeks, and you will not gain a single drop of muscle in those muscles again as long as you're using that same tension and that same workload. But comparing workload is a valuable tool when looking at any given exercise. The problem we get into is that when people try to compare cross exercise, and before long machine lifts start to look like the best lifts. Why? Because they allow the most tonnage to be moved. And the partial reps allow the most tonnage to be moved also. Meaning, if you start shortening down the range of motion, you can usually lift a heavier weight. And you can oftentimes do it for more reps. So what ends up happening is that different exercises have different ranges of motion. You move the weight a different distance sometimes. So they're not always useful for comparing one exercise to another, and different leverages allow for more weight than others. In fact, most people can flat bench more than they can incline bench. The incline uses a little less of the lower chest, which is a very big, very powerful muscle. Okay, so you're going to lift a little less weight. Also, the incline is usually a slightly longer range of motion than your flat bench. A lot of people aren't aware of that. Those two combined together, most people lift less weight on it. But by that same token, the incline is still a great stimulator of muscle growth. But if we were to only compare tonnage and we start comparing different exercises, it doesn't work. It doesn't work as a cross comparison, and it doesn't work when you start shortening the range of motion or changing what you're doing. Again, tonnage or volume is something that we can use to compare how much work a set of muscles have been subjected to when we keep a lift constant on your barbell squat, on your full range of motion bench press. Even on your lat pull down, it doesn't matter. As long as it's an exercise you're consistently doing the same range of motion and it obviously has the same leverages and everything because it's the same exercise, then you can compare it using tonnage over time. And it's a way to track how much work you're doing for people who really want to be meticulous about that. And again, you can look at different phases of your tonnage, and it's also one of the things you'll notice is that you will start to overreach or burn out sometimes at a given tonnage. Meaning when you start looking at different workouts, you'll find very quickly that if you're deadlifting, usually for some person when they get to about 8,000 pounds of deadlifting per week and 6,000 or 7,000 pounds of squatting per week, when both of those numbers get right around there, they start to notice mild overreaching symptoms after a couple of weeks. So tracking tonnage is a good way to look at how your recovery curve is going, and it's a good way for an individual to track. If they really want to track this and write their own programming, they can look at their weekly tonnages on their big lifts and start to notice when they start to regress, they start to struggle with recovery, and learn how to push these things, how to peak these things. Meaning, they note that if after 3 weeks of moving roughly that tonnage, that they start to stall, stagnate, see overreaching. So in the future, coming up in their next phase of training, they know that they can only push that much tonnage. They can only push 7,000 pounds on their squat per week with 8,000 pounds on their deadlift, and whatever on their bench, their rows, or whatever. When they get to those numbers, they're only going to be able to push them really hard for about 2 weeks, then they're going to be overreaching, and then they'll need to back off and deload. All right, and that is where tonnage becomes really useful, because it is very comparative, meaning you can do 10 sets of 3 or even 8 sets of 3 and move the same tonnage as 3 sets of 10 on the same exercise. Less reps, less total reps, more sets with the heavier weight, your tonnages can be equal. They're going to have a relatively similar impact on your recovery curve. So looking at total tonnage moved on your big lifts can tell you a lot about what's going on with your recovery and how much workload and work capacity that you have before you start to reach that wall. And it'll let you, if you track these things personally, you'll start to find you can get an idea of usually how many weeks you can push a given type of tonnage before you're forced to back down. And you can pre-plan for it so that you can push yourself and then know when to back down. Know how far you can push yourself and then back down when you're writing your different programming and periodization. It can be a valuable tool for people who really want to push things to the next level, who've gotten well past their intermediate phase, they've built a solid foundation, and they want to try to program very effective training. It becomes important to know these things. They're useful, but people can get mixed up and say that, oh, more tonnage always equals more growth. That's not the case, because a lot of your reps with lighter weight becomes ineffective. Meaning when you're doing sets of 10, you honestly aren't stimulating much of anything the first 3 or 4 reps, right? Is that a fair statement? If you can do 10 reps for a couple different sets with a weight, it's not doing anything the first few reps. Whereas in a 3-rep set, 5-rep set, that first rep or 2, you might actually be doing a little bit of work. So the tonnages aren't fully comparable there. You would almost need to figure out only counting the tonnages of reps in which you actually feel like you're doing significant work. And that's the problem we run into with the ultra high rep training. Ultra high rep training, 20 rep sets can absolutely stimulate muscle growth. Don't let anyone tell you they can't. But you need to understand half of those reps aren't doing much of anything for you. Probably the first 10 reps in a 20 rep set are doing literally nothing to stimulate any muscle growth or adaptation. So you can reach really high tonnage numbers this way because, wow, I did 100 reps with 20% of my max or 30% of my max. Yeah, but that doesn't mean you're going to get twice the muscle growth that you did off of your 10 rep sets. It just doesn't work that way. It can still stimulate good muscle growth, mind you, as long as the workloads are high. But when you're doing really high rep sets, you need a lot of workload to stimulate muscle growth through the cumulative fatigue. So don't get too caught up in tonnages and volumes. We're looking at these purely to get an idea of how much work the muscle is doing so that we can balance recovery. We can make sure that the general upward trend in the work we're doing when we can't increase weight on the bar and we can't increase tension, because the goal should always be to ultimately increase tension, meaning you're only going to get so big doing 10 rep sets with 155 pounds on the bench press. You're probably eventually going to need it to get to 165, 185, 205. You're going to need to increase tension over time, but we reach a threshold oftentimes for long periods of time. The more advanced you get to where adding weight to the bar doesn't work, so you need to keep up with tonnages and volume to ensure that you're stimulating muscle growth until the muscles have grown enough that you can go ahead and increase the weight further. And it can be useful for that, and again, for balancing your overall recovery and knowing how much tonnage you can get away with moving per week before you start to reach that burnout phase. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.